Good morning, or afternoon, or evening if you're in Europe, or I don't know. Time zones are confusing these days. Welcome to another episode number 8 of UXR Conversations, the random YouTube shenanigans I started when a global pandemic hit this world, and hopefully it will be over soon. I'm just so excited for today's conversation. And I can't wait to jump into it. But in case you don't know me, because I haven't been loud enough on YouTube and other places, I'm Noam Siegel. I'm Director of Research at Wealthfront and the founder of UX Quests, which is this YouTube and newsletter and other things. And I'm delighted to have Andy Waugh with us today. He's the head of research at Airtable. Welcome, Andy. How's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for having me here, Norm. Appreciate it.
It really is my pleasure. Let me kind of embarrass you for a bit here for those of you watching who don't know much about Andy. Andy is a mixed methods UX researcher and software engineer, which is super interesting. Both your bachelor's degree and your PhD are in computer science, right?
Correct. Guilty.
And not from a school around here. Was it Bath, if I recall?
Yeah, Bath in the UK. And
Yep.
yeah, undergrad was in computer science, PhD was in computing, but with a focus on human-computer interaction.
Yeah. And then I think it's worth noting that you have applied experience in both qualitative and quantitative research methods, which I would suggest is kind of rare to have meaningful experience in both of those areas. And you've been involved in products that we probably all know. You probably all know Microsoft Office, Google Chrome, Instagram, Uber and Uber Eats, and these days Airtable. And we're going to get to the spicy topic we're going to be talking about in a second. But I think part of the reason we're talking about coding and whether researchers should be coding and the democratization of software development is because Andy has these strong technical skills that have allowed him, among other things, to train machine learning models, develop prototypes, production systems, and contribute to open source software projects. And in addition to your IC work, you've also built teams at Instagram and these days Airtable, which I love, by the way, and I've used and will probably continue to use. And so today, we're going to do something that I find always incredibly fun. We have a spicy topic. We have what I call a hill you're willing to die on. And the hill that Andy has chosen to climb today is that researchers should be coding, that software development should be democratized. I think we'll hear in a second from Andy. I have recently been given the privilege to work with Wes Kao, who was the co-founder of Alt MBA with Seth Godin. And these days she's the founder of a new educational platform, which I'm going to be an instructor on. And she calls this sort of topic a spiky point of view. And by that, she means a perspective that others can disagree with, a belief you feel strongly about and you're willing to advocate for. It's a thesis that you have about topics in your realm of expertise. And this seems rather spiky to me. So if you're watching this live and you want to send us questions or comments or shout at us about, why we're bringing up something like whether researchers should code, feel free. I'd love for you to get involved in the conversation. Okay, Andy, was that fair? I mean, I think I was kind of a little bit biased there towards my own perspective. I didn't give you a great head start. And I'm also wearing this T-shirt just to show everyone. But you go ahead. Give it your best shot. Researchers should code.
Yeah, I've got a steep hill ahead of me to climb. So maybe I'll put a few caveats in place first. When I say researchers should code, I don't mean that researchers should become production software engineers. Right. And I'm also going to be very liberal with the word code.
Okay.
So I think like the end, I don't necessarily think that this is a world that we live in today or maybe tomorrow, but I think it's going to become a core part of our discipline. And in fact, most other disciplines, and let's say the next generation of researchers who come along, sciences and your humanities subjects, today, computer science is a core part of education going up. Also, the number of resources that are available to people is basically making computer science and programming, coding, a core skill. So the next generation of researchers that we see coming into our industry will have some proficiency in coding. So I think like that's one in terms of one point of my argument for this prediction to the future. Plus all of like the funding and investment from governments and private organizations that are trying to up-level people's coding ability, especially from a young age.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, you know, we currently live in Silicon Valley, at least for the next couple of months before we move to the Silicon Swamp, by the way, aka Miami, hashtag Miami Tech. And you know, my daughter's in kindergarten. She has computer science lessons, which may be a function of, again, living in Silicon Valley. But the bottom line is, every Tuesday she's learning computer science and the fundamentals of coding. So far so good. No argument for me.
Excellent. So then my other premise for this direction as well is just how as careers or disciplines have developed over time is how they've become more multidisciplinary. Like you could say the whole birth of human-computer interaction and UX research came out of the marriage of psychology and computer science. And if we're thinking about data science, this came out of the marriage of software engineering and statistics, mathematics. And so I think that as we have the merging of these disciplines coming together, it also makes more sense that we might see more technical application in the social sciences. And we even see this today when like we have people at, for example, Facebook, who call themselves computational social scientists. And they are applying computational techniques to research. There's very few of them, but it's an emerging field. And I think we're going to see more of it in the future.
Yeah.
So I'd say that would be my second part of my prediction of where we're going here.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking of many things. One of them is the horrible set theory classes I had to sit through in statistics.
Hated set theory.
And I'm kind of thinking of, you know, what constraints are you putting when you say researchers? Let's start with the researchers, and then let's get into code. Okay. So when you talk about researchers, what's the set? What's the subset? Like, how are you organizing that in your mind when it comes to this thesis? I'm trying to understand that part.
I think that's a great question. I will say that when we can use the term researchers very broadly, when I'm thinking about it though, I do think about it in terms of like our discipline, in terms of user experience research or product research, whatever flavor, design research, whatever you want to call it. And I think, so there are people like myself and there are others out there, there's a few of us who do apply computational techniques to our discipline. I know where, I'll give you one example. I was using DScout to conduct a diary study at Uber Eats of basically everyday eating behavior. And we had like just over 100 people across the US keeping a food diary for every day for just over a week, recording every meal that they had and answering some questions about that meal. And there were thousands and thousands of data points. And when I basically spent 3 weeks coding all of this data with 2 other people. And I said to myself, there has to be an easier way. And then I started basically going down this rabbit hole of natural language processing, and then discovered the whole field of topic modeling. And then I started asking myself the questions like, if I gave a model all of this open-ended data, could it tell me the categories that I were coding myself manually? The short answer is like, not quite. There was a lot of like fuzzy area, but in terms of some of those most prevalent categories, it was picking up on them. And that gave me hope that there is a direction of applying some of these techniques in the future to these actual types of analyses that we might be doing in our own field, especially as we're like, we're getting various tools and that allow us to scale and conduct research at scale and gather more data. We need to reinvent the ways that we think about analyzing this data. So it wasn't perfect, but I saw a way of moving there. And I am by no means a data scientist, but it's remarkable how easy it is to use some of these natural language processing tools. Like these days, you just plug the data in, you tune the parameters, and you get an output. Because it's not like the going back a decade or so where all of this had to be done by hand. The tools have come a long way.
I think part of my claim would be, though, that it's easy, so to speak, partially because you, in particular, have the foundations and the connection with these sort of tools and processes to kind of dive into them. Let me say something else. One of my spikiest videos, which I kind of almost received a hate email for, was around the idea that there is no generalist, that this notion of a mixed methods researcher, behind that hides a lot of mediocrity that in some cases can be dangerous. So my thesis is that we have a huge responsibility as researchers. We want a seat at the table, but at that table, if we get that seat, important decisions are being made, and some of us are working in crucial areas in our society. I mean, for me, Uber Eats is crucial. I'm not sure what I would do without Uber Eats, but I am talking a little bit more about areas like healthcare and education, or my area these days, finance, where we may be holding people's entire life savings, investments. It's a huge responsibility. And what I take from that is that I believe in the importance of expertise. And I fear that if people's aspiration is to be mixed methods researchers or also code in addition to other things, they will not have expertise in anything. They will simply be mediocre or worse in multiple things, and that could lead to critical errors. And I don't want to bring up any particular companies in this conversation. I really don't want to do that live on YouTube. But I'm sure the people watching, I'm sure you can think of certain cases in the past few years where dangerous things happened and tragic things happened that were probably partially because of flawed insights, poor research, and just a bad kind of process for crafting the user experiences we're in charge of. And so that's kind of my view on the notion of being mixed methods, being a generalist, and that's my fear when it comes to researchers exploring coding, or everyone watching this kind of aspiring to explore coding. What I think we may reach agreement on is that there is, going back to the set theory or whatever, there's probably a subset of researchers who have some great foundations like you do in computer science. Whether it's formal education or informal education, it can be a Coursera certificate. It doesn't matter. And they choose to specialize in these things, and they become, I'm not sure what the new title will be. We have enough titles to be fair, in our profession already, but maybe there'll be this new title. So I'm curious to hear your take on that, and if you view things the same way.
I think you bring up a great point. I don't think we can be a master of all research methodologies, all techniques, and all skill sets. And I agree that we're going to have some people who have like a broader set of skills, maybe expertise in a few. And I truly believe in people having expertise in a few skills. Like, I'm by no means the best interviewer, the best person at like going out and doing field research, the best person at doing usability tests. Like, I have enough knowledge potentially to be dangerous. But I do, one technique that I am particularly strong in, I believe, is like experimental design. It's like my brother, if there was one research technique that you was going to say, Andy, like, what's your superpower? It'd be experimental design. And I've been doing that since my academic studies all the way through most of my industry career as well.
Yeah.
And I feel like that has had application to other techniques as well, such as the systematic nature of designing experiments has had application to usability testing, for example, survey design. So there are transferable skills there, but I'm by no means, I know people who are survey scientists and they're just like in a different league to me. So I by no means claim to be an expert in some of those techniques. I think when it comes to coding, though, I guess I'm thinking of it as more of a way of extending our specializations. So in the case of, like, I wouldn't expect a researcher to have like a researcher hat, be doing a whole bunch of research, and then be expected to program a production system. And then maybe put on their business analyst hat and think about what's the business model for actually making this. Like, that's nonsensical. In 2017, I tried to start my own business, and it was horrible trying to do client relationships, code the application, be the marketing person for it as well. All I wanted to do was make something great. And so I think really there, it's more about, if we do have specializations, how could we potentially apply some of these like computational techniques to actually enhance our ability, our analyses, our ways of collecting data? So a few examples. When I was at Google, we wanted to run a diary study. So I created a Chrome extension that would basically just pop up in the corner and would actually use a Google form or a Google spreadsheet, or a Google form that connected to a Google spreadsheet as a way of collecting the data. It's just embedded there. And using that, so I could ask people to install this extension and then use this as a data collection method.
You could have built Dscout. You could have been CEO of whatever you chose to call your Dscout. This was before Dscout was out, right?
This was in, I think I did this in like 2012. I think Michael probably would have been studying Dscout probably before this time. Okay. Yeah, so not ahead of my time there. One thing that was ahead of my time is there was a crew at Microsoft that I was a part of. There were actually two other computer scientists who was working on Microsoft Office. And Microsoft Office back then had to be installed using a DVD. How do you do remote testing on something that requires local installation? So we actually built usertesting.com before it existed for client-side software. There was a way that you could use the Windows remote desktop to remote into a remote server on the Microsoft campus that Office was actually installed on, and people could use it and the tasks would appear, etc. Like another way of actually thinking about how do we scale research there.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing. And I spoke to Steve Portugal on his podcast Dollars to Donuts, and you talk about expertise. Steve Portugal, in my mind, is one of the best interviewers, UX research interviewers in the world, and because he's such an incredible interviewer, our conversation went in directions I was never expecting to go down. One of them was around the idea of research methodologists. So what I meant by that is that in my field of my academic field of psychology, some psychologists are methodologists. They develop new statistical techniques. They develop packages in R for better meta analyses. They are thinking at the meta level about how we can approach research in more innovative ways. And we don't really have that. Not officially. We have people who years ago at Microsoft developed this cool kind of usertesting.com sort of thing, as you noted. That's really quite incredible to hear. But we don't really have that sort of role in our field right now. And when I hear you talking about this, that's what comes up for me. If that makes sense.
I don't. Yeah, I guess I agree. We don't have it as a field, but we have entrepreneurs who are increasingly thinking about tools in our field. It's like we've already mentioned Dscout. I think it's a great example. Dovetail, Enjoy HQ, Alpha HQ. There are people who are starting to develop these tools of ways of collecting data for maybe using more traditional user experience and marketing research techniques and actually try to do them at scale as teams try to make more data-informed decisions. I feel like some of these tools are not just tailored at user experience researchers though, or a broader set of researchers. They're also trying to appeal to the designers and the product managers as a way of giving them access. So in a way, dare I say it, democratizing user experience research.
Totally agree. So let's talk about the coding part as well a little bit. I got a question on LinkedIn about from Susie Ross about whether using R is coding, or what do you mean by that, or Python? Was that more scripting and coding would be building a JavaScript app that does something, or so again, how do you define the coding part of this argument? What would I need to be doing as a researcher?
That's a great question. I would say that there are elements of R and Python. I do consider them coding. Okay. And they do help a lot with analysis. So I think a great example of this is computer programs are great for doing laborious tasks that are very repetitive in nature. So I was working with a researcher at Uber actually, and we were doing a survey. And as part of this, it was a very complicated, large-scale survey. There was going to be lots of different cuts of different groups to analyze their behavior and what they were reporting on. And I actually worked with this researcher to identify resources for her to learn how to code in Python, and mentored her to actually how to analyze survey data using Python and pandas and various visualization libraries such as Seaborn. Because once you wrote the script once, no matter how the data source might be changing, you can just click play and your script runs through the code. Nothing has to be repeated. Now, let's say you were trying to do that in Excel. If your data model changed at all, or you had to do a different cut, and the cell ranges didn't match, everything would break. And with a code, this allows us to be more efficient yet there. So I do consider that to be an element of coding. Now, I will say that I want to push on this, though, to a little bit further in terms of where we can be going with coding and user experience research. And this comes from a conversation with one of the design directors that I had, Evelyn Kim, on Uber Eats, who was talking to me about how Andy, like the research team is coming to us with these great insights. We know that they're great insights, but we don't always know how to translate them into something tangible. There's like a chasm that has to be crossed here. And I felt in my experience, being able to try to take some ideas that I've had from observations and actually turn them into a tangible like prototype, something very rough. And this could be, by the way, I can be very liberal with the idea of prototyping here. Personally, I've like coded systems, but a Figma prototype could also be one way of going that little bit further that doesn't require you to actually code. But we have so many tools available these days that allow us to actually make something more tangible. And that bridging of the chasm, like this Evelyn said to me, it doesn't have to be the solution, but some way of just crossing from this insight to solution is would be very helpful for our product discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest you skipped a stage there, which is kind of the recommendations. So from insights to recommendations to prototypes. I forget who it was. I think it was a person who managed research at New York Times, maybe, or some sort of publishing. So never mind. But I recall listening to an interview with this person, and she was what I would consider kind of a research purist, in the sense that she did not believe researchers should be making recommendations. She believed research ends at insight, and then it's someone else's job, a designer, an engineer, or a combination of a few of those individuals, to take those insights and build an experience based off. Other researchers I know would say that's mistaken, and that researchers should at the very least make recommendations. What you're saying is that researchers should not only make recommendations, they should manifest those recommendations in some level of fidelity prototype. It can be fairly low fidelity and in Figma, or even, I don't know, I suppose it could be on, using pen and paper even. And it could be as high fidelity as something that's actually kind of coded, and that you can use. So does that make sense? What's your thinking on that?
That makes a lot of sense. One thing that I'll say throughout my career is, like, when I started like in industry and I was at Microsoft, our director of our group insisted that every research finding was accompanied by a recommendation.
Yeah.
And I found this actually to be a very jarring experience, because I was basically saying to my colleagues, designers, product managers, you're wrong, here's why, here's a better way to do it. And that just feels a bit jarring. So when I went to Google and I had a bit more autonomy, every research report was framed in terms of, here is the insights, here's the data that I collected, and here's my interpretation of that data. And then recommendations were basically outside of the research report. Because I find that when developing product changes so quickly and over time, and there's many different data inputs that actually change the final product. But if you conduct a piece of research and you conduct it well, that should stand alone as something for time. So everything else that happens outside of that can be more malleable. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have workshops, etc. So when I went to Instagram, unless we were doing a particular technique that would come up with a strong recommendation that we were confident in, we would frame things in terms of how might we. So being more of a seed of exploration. And Instagram was a great environment for having this, working with designers to like use how might we and design thinking to think about what could be within the product. Then I went to Uber and I tried using how might we. How might we did not work there. Uber is a very action-oriented company. You need to tell your product team what to do there. So the research had to be oriented in such a way that you were making a recommendation based on user research and other data inputs about what we should be doing. But then outside of all of this, the more senior you grow in your career, you don't just become someone who is a researcher and doing research. You're someone who is basically the shepherd of the product. And if that means you having to put the hat of a designer on and do some sketching of what this might be, or put the hat of a PM on and start creating some specification for what a solution might be, or even the hat of a developer and like coming up with a prototype or a solution, this can enable you to accelerate and interpret research results so they are acted upon. They actually become actionable because you take it part of the way there that other people can look at it and say, I get it. And I will take this a step further. And if I can, I'd like to share a story of this from when I was at Google.
Yeah.
Which was one evening I was at home with my partner at the time, and they called me over to look at something on their computer. So I walked over, and they tried to find the thing that they were looking for, but in the web browser, but they had so many tabs open and they were really small and you could barely see the fav icon. And they were clicking around and they couldn't find it.
Sounds familiar. Sounds familiar.
It should be familiar to a lot of people. So I started walking away and said, call me back when you find it. And she said, no, stay here. I'll find it quickly. And then I asked the question, why do you need so many tabs open? And I was like, well, maybe I'll want to go back to something later. So when she wasn't looking, I decided to close a tab and see if she would notice. And she didn't. And then I did it again. And at least she didn't complain about it, or if she did want to go back to it, she would open it up again. Now, I don't scale to everyone in the world to go around closing tabs that they're not using. So I wrote a program that would monitor the usage of a tab. And if it wasn't being used, it would close the tab. But it would keep a reference to it in case someone wanted to reopen it. So I built this and I sent it around to the Chrome team. And I didn't think much of it at the time, but some of the engineers were very ecstatic about it because they saw something that I hadn't seen. Like I'd seen something trying to solve the problem of reducing clutter based on an observation. They saw a way of reducing the memory footprint that Chrome was using that would then increase performance of the browser. So I worked with an engineer to actually build out this extension that I had built, and a bunch of production engineers actually put this into code today. And we have a pattern around this, and of the billions of people who use Chrome, there is this algorithm sitting in the back that is basically making their browser less memory intensive and more performance. So this is what I mean about going from observation to a prototype that others can then click to say, I can see something that I can do here. If I had just talked to someone about that observation, we might not have made it all the way
there. Yeah. I'll just say, by the way, I'm big into TikTok these days, and there's probably some more work to do on Chrome because one of the fun trends on TikTok is people saying that, the second they open more than one tab on Chrome, they can like cook an egg on their laptop and they kind of
it's a feature.
They put yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to use that kind of cop out, then sure you can. But I love that. I love that story, and I love that impact. So let me ask you: you are the head of the research function these days, and so I want to ask you if you want some of the researchers on your team to put those hats on, including that developer hat, to extend their work beyond just research, beyond recommendations, and maybe build something, whether it's in Figma or otherwise. how do we help researchers get there, right? How do we manifest this future that you are envisioning, where researchers have some coding abilities?
Great question. Like, I'm not gonna like force anyone into this world of learning to code.
Sure.
But I will be more than happy to be a resource to those people who need my support along the way and mentorship. So, for example, the colleague at Uber who was learning Python, and we would meet up a few times a week to review like the learning progress that she had made on her own and talk about. I was able to provide some explanation as to why things were working the way that they did, to the point where she pretty much did the entire analysis and visualization of this large survey all by herself. Currently at Airtable, I have a goal for everyone on my team to be proficient with SQL, for example, so they can do their own querying. One of the ways that we're helping here is, like, for one, like DJ, who we both know, she created like an SQL cookbook, which is basically a guide to help people get started and understand the environments they are and a few best practices along the way. One of my direct reports recently asked me in a one-on-one, say, Andy, can you set us more SQL challenges so we actually have time to actually practice and think about how we can use this? So every Monday, I set out an SQL challenge. It's completely optional. And then during some free time, our researchers will try to complete that challenge and then send their solutions to the chat. And I was so pleased yesterday because I saw someone's solution and they wrote a more elegant solution than I had. And that made me so happy that they had done this. And so I will continue to provide my team with the coaching and the resources that they need in order to develop these skills, if that's something that they wish to do so. In general, for like the larger community, like there's a lot of resources out there for learning how to code on the web. Code Academy is one, for example, which I frequently use to learn different languages and just like brush up on my own skills. YouTube, full of channels with people talking about various things, to like resources to learn how to code. And then there's also a number of websites that provide sort of like exercises or challenges for you to try on your own, like things to code, which is a good inspiration for just trying to make something. But ultimately, I think it could be anything as like starting off with sketching, then thinking about maybe like Figma, then thinking about making it interactive, and then slowly taking baby steps to maybe moving in this direction.
Yeah. I love the sequel challenge idea. That's a really cool one. And I like the sequel cookbook idea that that DJ implemented. That sounds interesting as well. Sometimes I wonder why we don't make it easier on ourselves as researchers and keep just open libraries of code and tools, right? Just like engineers use, right? It's almost as if we tend to kind of reinvent the same queries, the same code again and again. I would kind of love for us to have a research dedicated repository at each of our respective companies with all of the code and the queries, whether it's in Python, R, SQL, that we use to analyze various data. And
100%. We recently actually created created a research workspace for all of our queries on our team. So it's like a place that anyone can go and they can just poke around something that they know works, and there's like a description of what it was intended to do. So if we ever like need to run a study, we can just like take that same query, and we're hoping to give people like enough knowledge of SQL where they can manipulate that query to their own needs without
Right.
necessarily having to write it all from scratch.
And that's in Airtable, I imagine? The workspace?
Oh, no, that workspace, we use Mode as a querying and data analysis and reporting platform. So they have everything exists in there, so you can just like click on a query and then run it straight from there.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to those of you who are watching, by the way, if you have a question or comment before we end, I'd love to take it. We did get an interesting comment from Alex around how this is news to me. There is apparently a field of computational psychiatry where they use reinforcement learning algorithms as models of human cognition to study mental health, which sounds fascinating. And I wasn't aware that this was a growing field. So I'm very curious to hear more. And maybe Alex, we can chat about this at some point in the future. If anyone else has a question before we need to end in a few minutes, please let us know. And yeah, I love that. Again, I just think it's, if we're going to be coding, I think we should embrace some of the great practices that our fellow engineers have in terms of, for example, keeping a great workspace or repository of the code base we're using. That makes sense to me. And I wonder, do you think there's room in the research realm, I mean, for like open source projects? Like, are there things you could work on that wouldn't be proprietary to Airtable and that you think other researchers could leverage? Or if you had a very talented researcher on your team who was an expert at coding, do you think there's anything they could generate that would be applicable? Again, as like a new method or a new tool in other companies as well, or is that kind of irrelevant or unrealistic?
Well, I guess like one example of this is like R packages, which I think we've
Sure.
talked about. Like people can create these and contribute to them and make them available to the wider community. The same exists for Python as well, in terms of packages that can be available there. GitHub as well. Like generally, like a lot of people think about GitHub as a place of more coding projects. I personally haven't seen anything related to research on there, but I guess there's like nothing from stopping people from putting their own tools and extending them out and publishing them there.
Yeah. One example I can think of, which I think, I mean, maybe it was open source. When I was at Airbnb, someone, I'm not sure who, created an R package which basically standardized all of the data visualizations that we produced to make sure that we were all using the kind of the Airbnb font and Airbnb colors and all of these different things. And that was fantastic. And I'm a huge believer in constraints, in the sense that rather than spending endless time educating people about best practices for data visualization, if there were a package out there that would enable you to tweak some parameters, to your point, and the rest would just happen magically, and your visualizations would all be beautiful and according to best practices, that to me would be super cool. And that to me is an example of something that could be open source potentially. Does that make sense? So do you have anything like that at Airtable, or have you seen anything like that elsewhere?
That's a great question.
Could be a good project.
It could be a good project. Like I think like Grace has like mentioned like JS Psych here is an example of an open source project there. I remember when I was at Uber, I had this project where we needed to run studies in Mexico, Brazil, and the US. And our design team had, being in the US, they produced a prototype in with English copy. And then one of my colleagues in Mexico and Brazil had to spend an entire weekend translating the copy. And I said, there must be an easier way. So I wrote a Figma plugin that would basically use the Google Translate API to translate all strings in a Figma prototype. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it publicly available because it used my corporate credit card to pay for the translations. But there is a community of people who create such application of these techniques being applied to our research methodologies that allows them in ways to be more robust in order to scale, become more efficient. In some ways, and this is a very maybe like jarring statement. If we do have UX proficient in, let's say, the next generation, will we start to see the merging of disciplines such as data science with user research and have more of these hybrid scientists that sit across actually merging qualitative and quantitative data where the boundaries between them are not as distinct because the scale at which we can collect different types of data and analyze that data become more blurred? Probably not, but I'll put that out there as a controversial statement.
Yeah. We shall wait and see. But until then, thank you so much for engaging in a particularly spicy topic. And this was a lot of fun. We do have to end. We both have other things to get to. But thank you so much. And I'll just say that I know one shout out we can give here is that Airtable is hiring, and you are hiring in particular for the research team, right? What roles are you still hiring for these days?
So yeah, research at Airtable started last year. We're at 5 researchers at the moment. We're going to be growing to 16 in the next 6 months. We're hiring qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers, and brand and marketing researchers to operate across our product org and company.
Amazing. I do want to say I'll go on record saying that Andy, I really admire you. I think you've had an incredible career. I view as an outlier almost. And if any of you are watching, you probably want to go work at Airtable and with Andy because I'm sure the team you're building is amazing. And few things will determine your growth and your learning and your development and how much fun you have and just the trajectory of your career more so than the people you get to work with and the managers you get to have. So anyone would be incredibly fortunate to work with you, Andy. And yeah, you should head over to that page and apply if you're interested, whether you code or not, by the way. And Andy can help you out if you're interested in it. He will find you or provide you with the mentorship you need to do that. And then when it comes to me, there's a lot going on right now. I just want you to know that I also do a newsletter called UX Quests, and you can use this coupon code to get a discount for the paid weekly newsletter. I put out a lot of spiky opinions and hills to die on and hopefully helpful content. I'm talking to Steve Portugal this Friday. We are going live this time on Clubhouse to talk about evolving the UX research practice, which seems highly relevant to the conversation that Andy and I just had. So if you are on Clubhouse, and if you want an invite, let me know. Please join us on Friday. I believe it's 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then if you're looking for me, then these are the places where you can find me. I'd love to have a UXR conversation with you as well, if you'd like. Thank you to Vanessa and Catalina and Grace and Alec and Eli for joining and everyone else who joined. But again, a special thanks to you, Andy. Always a pleasure, and you're always invited to come on additional random UXR conversations anytime. Thank you so much. This was great.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Noah. I really appreciate it.
All the best, everyone. Andy, you stick around for a second before we leave, but to everyone else, all the best. Have a great day. stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you next time on UXR Conversations, which is going to be very soon, and there's going to be some more spicy topics. You can bet on that. Bye for now.